Hello everyone. Today I will be doing our first discussion presentation on engineering writing/writing engineering by Dorothy A. Windsor. To begin, I wanted to start with a brief outline. First, we'll be talking about the idea of transmitting versus generating knowledge and the overall idea that engineering tends to generate knowledge while writing tends to merely transmit it. We'll also be looking at engineering texts and the role they play, and the idea of engineering knowledge versus scientific knowledge and the distinction between the two. In addition, we'll be looking at oral presentations and the role they play in the life of an engineer. So our main character, so to speak, in this story is John Phillips. He's our PhD in mechanical engineering that the author chooses to focus on. He has 15 years of work experience in engineering, and he presented a paper to the Society of Automotive Engineers showcasing his group's effort to lower engine emissions to meet standards issued by the EPA. He hoped this information could be useful to other engineers looking to lower emissions on their own engines, and the author of our paper chose to focus on John Phillips to see the role of writing as an engineer. To begin with, analysis of engineering texts. In the laboratory, the texts are provided by constantly accumulated combinations of measurement traces like graphs, figures, printouts, diagrams, etc. Written texts, for the most part, come from recorded measurements and laboratory values. So, for example, if we take a thermometer reading of temperature and we write down the number, we can consider that to be our text. A lab report giving pieces of specific data can be used along with other reports to create a curve showing a trend, and we can use a curve to support a theoretical claim in a paper. In that regard, knowledge is constructed through text and is not discovered in the original process of lab works. Any knowledge gained from these texts is therefore constructed through these texts, and in that regard, writing can generate knowledge. It doesn't necessarily have to transmit it, as we said earlier. Knowledge is social in nature. It can be defined as that which most people in a discourse community are convinced of, and it's usually the texts that indicate whether or not they're convinced. In the world of science, something must be accepted by the broader scientific community for it to be called knowledge, and it must be convincing. So, in that regard, writing is very important to an engineer who must not also have the proper results in their experiments, but also be able to formulate and write down their opinions. For it to be truly considered knowledge, it must be convincing to the people in their broader context. So, for example, the engineering world. The difference between engineering and science. So, in engineering writing is not incidental to the project at hand. Engineers are concerned with producing a physical object, such as an engine, and so they are not concerned with writing as a means to their end. Science, on the other hand, produces knowledge in such a way that it does use writing as a means to its end. What this means is that the engineer is more concerned with producing an object, and that's their contribution, whereas writing isn't necessary to their contribution. Windsor will argue that this distinction between the two is not as strong as we may think. Phillips, in writing, drew upon writing in text to produce his final work. We'll also look at the importance of oral presentations. Phillips had 8 sets of handouts from presentations given by 2 people who worked for him. At one point, he called these handouts, not the engine, the raw material of his paper. While oral presentations during meeting were an integral part of the process, these handouts contained writing that helped conceptualize improvements for the final product. Those at meetings could use the handouts to formulate their own interpretations of the data sheets, which themselves did not hold meaning. What this means is that you could look at a giant table of data, for example, filled with numbers, but without these handouts that Phillips had written and distributed at his meetings at his firm, the numbers wouldn't have held much meaning, and we can even go further as to say that they wouldn't have generated any new knowledge other than their existence as numbers. Which leads us to our last point of knowledge of document equals knowledge of thing. The author had a conversation with Phillips about how he wrote his paper, and in it he explained that the documents that described the engine, which is our thing, actually became the thing. For an engineer to be accepted as an engineer, he or she must write and speak in the already created forms and tongues of engineering. While it is possible to say that engineers create themselves in text, it is also possible to say that they are created by the text available to them. Producing handouts for these oral presentations forced Phillips to tell a story about the engineering process that would not otherwise be told from the more traditional form of engineering. To conclude, we have to think that this is not a very broad study. We were looking at one engineer, so one writer from one company. He worked in research and design, not as a field manager, and so his job was inherently in the business of producing knowledge and writing as opposed to producing actual products. And we can conclude from this paper that the idea of engineers as being primarily numbers-based people is not necessarily a correct one. In fact, the author claims that writing does play a big role in the lives of engineers, and this point does bring up one concern I had, which is the idea of bias. It seemed as though after reading this paper, it seemed as though writing was very integral to the engineering process, and I wonder how true that really is. So my first question is, should engineering firms be required to have evidence of writing competency along with engineering skill? This would be in favor of the author's argument that writing is engineering. And secondly, as the point I raised earlier, does Windsor's position as a scholar of writing pose a problem in terms of bias? I couldn't help but think that Windsor, a scholar of writing, was very much in favor of writing and didn't really seem to think that it shouldn't be overlooked.